I wanted to ask you about recording because I know that a lot of folks um, who watch these conversations, they're just getting into home recording for the first time this year, either because of the pandemic or just for whatever reason they're just diving into it now. And the kind of questions that people ask me are like, well, should I try this DAW or that? Do you like Logic or Luna or whatever? And when I ran into you on the street the other day, you had gone so many light years past that conversation that I was just really intrigued. You were
Mhm.
talking about not Nagra, but a different, something from that world,
Mhm.
recording on tape, but not on a machine that people might even be familiar with. So I'm just wondering what are you using, and how did you get to that, and what does it do for you?
You mean the reel-to-reel recorder specifically?
Yeah, and any other part of it, but let's start there.
Okay, well, um, that's a good question, and I'm not sure if one that I can logically answer, but what does logic have to do with any of this anyway,
None,
right?
nothing, zero.
So, God, I can't remember the first I heard about Nagras, which for those of you who don't know, which is probably most of you, a Nagra was, I think, qualified as being a field recorder, right? So in the days before digital, there were these small reel-to-reel recorders that you could put over your shoulder and go out into the field,
Hmm.
meaning somewhere outside of a recording studio to record, the sound of nature, or they were used I think exclusively along with the brand that I have, which I'll go into a little bit in a second, to record location sound for films.
Right.
This is up until whenever the first, I guess, DAT machines came out, which were in the 80s, maybe late 80s.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. So, a good friend of mine and colleague and extraordinary musician, Craig Taborn, told me that he had gotten a Nagra. I don't know if he wants me to tell anybody that, but and was saying that they sounded just super cool, kind of different than a larger Studer or Revox, the kind of two-track reel-to-reels that you would see in a studio
Hmm.
for, I don't know exactly what they're used for, two-track recordings, I mean, stereo recordings or mix down, when you take a multi-track session and mix it down to stereo, the equivalent of a digital bounce. There are those reel-to-reels in studios. So I started researching it, as I've always wanted to have a reel-to-reel recorder. Um, I'm of the vintage that came up recording on tape. The first 10 or so years of my recording career, everything was in those days. I guess the first record I ever played on was probably 89 or 90. And so until the early aughts, everything was tape, either digital or analog, mostly analog in my experience. But I never owned an analog tape machine. So, and I don't really have room for the an 8-track or even a regular size stereo recorder. So I started researching this, and a friend of a friend of mine is into these kind of things and had a similar machine to a Nagra, but one that a lot of people think is sort of like the step up from the Nagra, which is called a Stellavox.
Hmm.
And it's the same thing. It's a very small, I can actually show it at some point.
Uh-huh.
Uh, it's a small stereo reel-to-reel recorder. And one of the cool things about it, nagras are either mono or stereo, and the Stellavox allows you to change the head block mechanism, which is what has the heads in it, from a mono to stereo.
Hmm.
So when you're recording on stereo, with stereo on tape, each track, if you will, although you can't overdub, is assigned to half the physical space of the tape. So if you can use a mono head block, then if you're just using one microphone, you're getting the full physical width of the tape.
Oh, okay.
So I have these two different head blocks. This is,
Oh, wow. Wow. Incredible.
it's a beautiful, I mean, it looks like a combination of a Patek Philippe and a Leica camera, you know.
Totally. Yeah.
This is the stereo head block. They're only 5-inch reels. So, you know, at 7.5 IPS, it's about 15 to 20 minutes, something like that. You can put more or less tape on a reel. Anyway, so you know, after a lot of research and back and forth, I opted to get one of these. They're actually smaller than Nagras. So it's really cool to be able to just carry it anywhere. You could, you know, bring it out to the country if you want to record some bird song, or to a gig if you want to record 15 minutes or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it took some doing to get it functional, because as I was explaining to you the other day, and which I somehow overlooked, you know, and what I thought was preparation to deal with an old reel-to-reel, namely years and years of buying old guitars and amplifiers, didn't actually prepare me for buying something old that has moving parts, which is an important distinction, because a reel-to-reel has things that are, you know, it's going like this all the time. So everything
Right.
has to be really, you know, something approaching perfectly configured in order for it to record signal without a lot of flutter,
Mm.
which
What's flutter?
flutter is, I mean, I'm not really qualified to describe it specifically, but if there's something happening in the machinations of the tape machine that makes the tape move even just the most microscopic amount, what you get is a kind of shaking sound, sort of,
Mm.
you know, vibrato-y sound with certain types of, more with certain instruments than others. It
Huh.
unfortunately it rears its ugly head, I think most noticeably with piano, oboe, and the guitar,
Hmm.
which I noticed when I first got it, and I had to have it, you know, examined a few times, and eventually it was figured out. These machines have only one motor in them. Larger machines have, I think, two or three, which makes them more stable.
Mm-hmm.
So these machines have to be, you know, really, really tuned up pretty well in order to function properly, which it's doing at this point. So anyway.
And how do you incorporate it into um, stuff that you're recording? Like as far as, I don't know if people send you a track to play guitar on, or stuff for your own music. How do you actually incorporate the Stellavox into your routine?
Well, on a few different levels, sometimes I've recorded things like, in terms of my own music, I've recorded, I don't have a piano, but in a couple different places, like piano ideas that I'll record onto the Stellavox with stereo miking, played along with a metronome through my earpiece. And then I'll come and dump that into Pro Tools. And because I've recorded it to a metronome, I can, you know, put it onto the grid in Pro Tools and use it. So it's on a very sort of basic level, it's just a really, really nice sounding remote recorder as opposed to recording something on my iPhone. It sounds about
Right.
4,000 times better. Um, and Also for my own music, what I've been doing lately is recording drum tracks. Like I have a drum set in my apartment that I can play, infrequently and quietly.
Okay.
But I'll do it like a two miking. I did it yesterday, two mics on the kit, turn the mic pre's on the Stellavox really loud so I can play really quietly,
Hmm.
and even get the pre's and the tape to overdrive a little bit, get that tape saturation kind of thing. Do that to a click, dump the drum tracks into Pro Tools, and they just sound really nice. It's a different sound.
Hmm.
And playing it on other people's stuff, or even on my own things where I'm overdubbing something, and trying to use the reel-to-reel deck, is a bit more complicated, but kind of doable. So there's a couple different ways of doing it that you record along with a Pro Tools track to the Stellavox in real time. But as all or some of you may know, that there's a delay in when you're recording to tape. I didn't
Hmm.
know this.
Oh.
This is where what delay comes from,
Hmm.
and I learned it in a very kind of dingbat intuitive way, that between the record head and the playback head is a little bit of space.
Hmm.
And if you, while you're recording onto analog tape, if you monitor from the playback head in real time, there's a delay between when you hit a note and when it registers. And that delay is the space between the record and the playback head, however long it is. And that is, again, this was kind of a great discovery. That's the sound, that is what delay is.
Oh,
If,
wow.
if on an old Echoplex, or any Echoplex, even the remakes, you move this thing along the little path that
Uh-huh.
is allowed. That's the record and erase head. And when you move it further away from the playback head, the delays get longer because of the space between those two things. And when you move it closer to the playback head, it gets shorter.
Hmm.
So
Huh.
on a delay thing, you're able to monitor both at the same time, so you can hear the attack and the delay. On a tape machine, and forgive me if any of this or all of this is just so unbelievably nerdy, um, this is where delay comes from. That guys, like Les Paul and noticed this, and I guess they
Sure.
would set up a tape machine that was a dedicated delay thing. And in order to increase the delay, I think what they did in the old days was they would just change the speed of the tape,
Right.
right? So they
Right.
would, either based on the available um, switches for IPS
Hmm.
switches, like 3 to 7 to 15 to 30, or they would, with voltage, they would slow and speed up by sending more or less electricity, I think, to the tape machine.
Yeah. And like earlier, you were mentioning, like, in talking about the Stellavox as an alternative to more kind of conventional reel-to-reel machines that you would see in a studio. These days, when I see a quarter-inch machine in a studio, that's about all they use it for, is like for tape delay. Like, oh, if you want that sound, rather than use a plug-in or a digital thing or whatever, if they want to get tape delay, like that's the only reason that they keep a quarter-inch deck around.
Well, that might be the best use for it. Um, for me, it's great because I mean, for one thing, one of the reasons I did this was because you could move around with it. I mean, it's portable.
Yeah.
which I want to be able to go places and record things, whatever they are. I mean, if it was a, you can get these extender things that allow you to run 10.5-inch reels, which would mean you could record a whole set. I'd really love to try to, I'd have to audition it, but to make some live recordings once we start playing live again.
Yeah.
My favorite live recordings are old live recordings like Band of Gypsies or Little Feat or like Train at the Vanguard. Those are my ideas of a great sounding live recording, which is not necessarily a multi-track anything. It's just the sound of a band in a room. So
right.
Anyway, but back to the trying to do this in real time with Pro Tools. So what you have to do is you can record, or I'll either record only to the reel-to-reel, but you have to have something that allows you to see where you can align it with your digital tracks, because it happens, I don't know, 800 milliseconds after you play it. So, and if you listen to the tape as you're recording it, you won't be able to play because all you hear is the delayed signal.
Right.
So you have to be able to monitor it somewhere else. Really, you have to monitor it, I mean, at the risk of just going deep nerd, but I guess all of this is, so why stop?
Why stop now? Yeah.
If I monitor exclusively on the Stellavox, I can listen to the sound just from the mic pre, so that I can hear my playing, in real time. There's a switch that says direct and tape. So if you listen to direct, you're just getting input. You're listening to the sound before the heads. If you switch it to tape, you hear that delayed recorded signal.
Mm-hmm.
So if I record all of this with a track in Pro Tools and record to the tape, I just have to play something that corresponds to a count off. So I'll put like 2 bars of click on Pro Tools, and I'll go clunk, 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 hopefully in time, so that when I either dump this thing into Pro Tools, if I'm just recording it onto the tape and monitoring it through the tape, I can then line up those things, those clicks that I'm doing along with the count off. Or if I can bypass the step of having to record it onto the tape and then record it into Pro Tools by having it record in real time directly to Pro Tools as I'm playing it. The only thing with that is you have to have it on the tape function, which would create the delay, because Pro Tools will pick up whatever is being sent out. So if I monitor it from the direct thing, Pro Tools will only hear input. So I will have to I can't monitor it then, other than from like if the amp is in the room. Does that make any sense? I mean, this is some elaborate voodoo. That bypasses the step of having to, record what I recorded onto tape into Pro Tools after the fact, but will not allow me to monitor from anywhere other than an amp in the room.
So that you have to really have faith in the process, I guess.
Well, yeah, you have to have a clear idea of what, you can obviously sound check it, hear what it's going to sound like. Right. But of course, you want to be able to hear what the final point of arrival is hearing or seeing, because you're playing to that, hopefully,
Yeah.
As we all know, the way your amp sounds in the room is pretty much always different than the way it sounds through microphones.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Anyway, but it's, as ridiculously elaborate as it may sound, and actually is, I've really been enjoying it because it's a different sound. It's the sound of tape. I think these machines sound different than a larger machine, but it's the sound of analog tape. I've always, especially for guitar sound, been drawn to the sound of tape. I remember in those few years, probably 20 years ago, when there were sort of equal amounts of analog sessions to digital sessions, I would always, I think, if memory serves, go, man, when I record the tape, the guitar just seems to sound a little nicer.
Mm.
You know, something, of course, in those days, A to D stuff was, sample rates were, there wasn't 192, and
Right.
obviously digital has gotten a lot better. But one of the things that spurred me onto this quest was I did a session a couple of years ago at a great studio here in the city, and I was doing the guitar sound test before we started recording.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a really simple setup. I think I was playing my old Telecaster through an old Princeton reverb. And I had a SM57, Shure SM57, and a Royer ribbon microphone, really typical
Yeah, classic.
thing. Right. And nothing, no pedals or anything. And I did my thing, and I was turning the amp up to get it to overdrive, which in my experience is often one of the more challenging sounds to record in the way that I hear it in the room.
Hmm.
It's like somehow when I add that, I really only use turned up amps for my distortion sound. And in my experience, when you put a mic right next to the speaker, it just picks up a lot of stuff that you don't hear as that sound sort of grows right away from it. So you have to, I've had to just do these things, you move mics around, you try to figure it out, and it usually gets something that is somewhat similar. Anyway, I did this at this session, and I went back to listen to the playback to my sound, which I, of course, always account for the fact that once other instruments start playing, that some of these things are going to be mitigated or changed, and you have to remain open, see if maybe the sound you like when your guitar is by yourself is not necessarily the sound that's going to work when other instruments start playing.
Yeah.
Which is an important factor, of course, in recording.
Yeah.
I went back into the control room, and the guy put the two mics up, and I had this very strange reaction in that I thought it sounded like way too good. And I started doing something. The engineer cracked up because I was like, well, where are the faders here? And he said, oh, there's two. And I started turning them up and down. And he was like, is anything wrong? And I said something to the effect of, no, I just don't understand why it sounds so good. And I was trying to do something to kind of like, why does this sound acceptable to me? It's usually kind of horrible when you just listen to it. And he goes, I don't know, maybe it's that. And he points at something, and I turn around, and there are these two big, it was being recorded to tape. And I didn't know the session was that we were doing it to. And I thought, okay, wait a minute. Is that really like the difference that the tape makes in my guitar sound? I can't say for sure, because of course you'd have to turn on something digital and the tape and really listen to them in a controlled environment. But I was like, this is what I always remembered about my reaction to my sound on tape versus digital, is that I would just go, I just like the way that sounds more. Anyway, that's not an objective argument for the sound of tape versus digital, but in here I've been able to A/B a lot, and it's dramatically different. So for certain things, I really, really love the sound of it. I mean, I feel it's I don't want to say better, because it's not really better. It's just different than digital. And for certain kinds of things, it sort of, I don't know, mitigates some problems that I have with getting my sound on tape or, onto a hard drive, and that it kind of cools some shit out, and, maybe is not an absolutely perfect representation of the sound of a microphone, 2 inches from a distorting guitar speaker. But who wants an accurate representation of that?
Uh,
Like if you put your ear there,
Yeah.
you'd go, that's horrible. Someone said, I was reading some tape guy engineer article who was sort of arguing for the use of 57s, which are, they're $80 microphones. They're not
Yep.
great. He's
Yep.
like, you don't want to put a Neumann U47 right next to a guitar speaker. Like it picks up way too much.
Hmm.
In a way, you want something that masks some of those sounds that, again, you're, as a guitarist, you don't listen with your ear next to the speaker. You're hearing a sound that's sort of, in some point in its travel, and that sort of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, blooms in a space, and you adjust accordingly, and you're reacting to that sound in a room. So anyway, that's a probably incredibly long-winded answer to your question, but that's how I'm rolling these days.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful. It since you mentioned the 57, that's is something I wanted to ask you, is that since you've gone to tape, um, have have you found that other mic choices are more complementary to tape than if you were just going into Pro Tools?
Well, my feeling about that is, the or my feeling about the relationship of microphones to the ultimate sort of recorded arrival point is pretty much the same.
Hmm.
But it shifted, I think, completely in that a 57 going to tape is a much more acceptable sound to me than a 57 going into Pro Tools.
Right.
I mean, you still hear the quality of the 50s, and my 57 might be like shot, but there's this sort of, papery sound to a 57 that's
Yeah.
always there.
Yeah.
But somehow it sounds nicer when I'm recording it to the tape, like it mellows it out a little bit. The quality of the tone of the mic is still there, but
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I mean, that's analogous even to the thing you said a minute ago. Like if you put a $4,000 mic up in front of an amp that's breaking up, it's going to hear things that you don't want it to hear. And in the same way, if you put a 57 into something that's sampling at 192, that's like a very like it's getting a lot of information. Maybe that's not you're hearing. I mean, we've all had the experience. You go into I don't know. Either like a sports bar that has a high def TV or some shop that's selling the newest TV, and it looks weird. Like
right.
like
Yeah.
I don't want to see all of
Right.
that information. Like I grew up, you know, with just little Panasonic Zenith television or
Mhm.
whatever. And so, yeah, there's like a limit to like how much information is actually good information in that regard.
Yeah.
Um, what about does the Stellavox allow? Can you plug a guitar into it and record directly if you want
You
to?
can. I've never tried to do it directly into the box. I've recorded going through like my interface, or I have a couple of old Neve mic pre's. Those are my two mic pre's outside of the mic pre's available on my interface that I use.
Hmm.
And I've gone directly through a tube direct box into the Neves and onto the Stella box. And it sounds, it's a warmer, I mean, to use a really not very objective term, warmer sound than if I just go through Pro Tools direct.
Yeah.
Again, this tonally speaking, and by tonally, I mean the basic sound, you can still hear it, that sound of direct guitar, which
Yeah.
I don't know, you know what that is. There's this
Yeah.
other thing that's sort of like it's kind of cool. Um, but I don't, it's certainly not what I like typically. Again, if I go right onto tape, it sort of mushes away some of the aspects of that sound that I typically don't like.
Right.
They don't disappear. It doesn't change in a basic structural way, but it just sounds nicer. Of
Right.
course, there's always the addition of tape hiss, which is noticeable if you're playing, it depends. If you're playing something really quiet, I mean, it's pretty noticeable. When you get above a certain decibel level, you don't notice it at all. But
Right.
certainly with drums, if there are any cymbals, it kind of washes that sound away. But
Right.
solo guitar, it's like, oh, that's the sound of tape.
Right.
And there's nothing on this thing that has like whatever technological advances they made with the Dolby or noise reduction stuff. There's none of that here. So
Huh. What? Whenabouts? When was it built? Your machine.
1975.
Okay. All right. Somehow I was thinking. I mean, that makes sense. The design of it, that totally makes sense. Somehow in my head, I was still picturing something from like World War II or something. But
Oh,
yeah, when you
those
look,
are,
yeah.
yeah, there's the original Nagras were from the 50s, I think.
Okay.
And just a teeny bit of historical background, which I found quite interesting. Studer, whose name I can't remember, the guy who designed the Stellavox, George Quelet, and the gentleman who designed the Nagra, whose name was something Kudelski, I think he was from Poland. They were all working in Switzerland. Studer and Quelet were Swiss guys. Um, and working on making tape recording better, like from the 50s, and I guess in the case of Quelle and Nagra, maybe through the 70s. I don't know when Studer died, but they were all part of this like group of people, I think mostly in Switzerland, working on developing reel-to-reel technology. So
Hmm.
the first Nagras, which I think are from the 50s, are, they're pretty prehistoric devices that if they break, they're very, very hard to fix. And each one got, you know, noticeably better and more functional up until I guess the last ones they made analog were in the 80s. And then I think they started making digital machines, as maybe Stellavox also did. The one that I have is a 7, and I think there was an 8 and a 9 that just added some functionality and frequency response. So anyway.
Hmm. And connecting to it, when I asked you about direct, I was thinking like, what maybe it's on Hunky Dory. There's a song called Eight Line Poem, where Mick Ronson's guitar has that direct sound.
Oh, really? I don't remember it. I love that record, but I'd have to go back and check it out.
Yeah, yeah. Check out Eight Line Poem. It kind of shocked me because most of the guitar on Bowie records from that era, it just sounds like
Yep.
rock. And then
Yep.
this is just
Marshall Les Paul.
yeah, this is such a different sound. And um, and then when I asked you, you mentioned what you can go through Neve 1073s. Um, do you, if you're hooking up microphones to the Stellavox, do you need to go through an external preamp, or it's got preamps on board and
They
you can
actually
just
have, yeah, nice preamps in the Stellavox, which was another kind of cool byproduct, is that I don't even have to turn the tape on. I can use the mic pre's just as additional nice mic pre's.
oh wow, and
Yeah,
in the record you can use them when you're recording, even if you're not
absolutely.
playing tape.
Yeah, I take an output of the Stellavox into my interface and into Pro Tools, just turn it on test, basically,
Uh-huh.
so that it's registering the input, leave it on the direct so that the sound is just the input,
Uh-huh.
right? And that will just go, send those two mic pre's into Pro Tools. So it's it's cool because I have, I think the mic pre's on my interface, which is an Apollo. It's fine,
Mm-hmm.
but I've never really used them for microphones. And the Neves are every fucking thing, excuse my French, that you would hope they would be. They sound just amazing. Anytime I've used something else, even the Stellavoxes, which are great, but the Neves are like, I mean, they're so great. But the mic pre's in the Stellavox are very nice, and
Uh-huh.
so it means that I have four outputs or inputs or whatever, of good mic preamp.
Uh-huh. And the Neves, are those like 500 series lunchbox things, or what do those look like?
They're the strips out of a console,
Oh, wow.
the mic EQs from I think an early '70s board.
Wow.
And they're housed in a power supply, what is called a boutique audio power supply that has the um, dials, which are the equivalent of the faders.
Yeah.
Um, and I bought them when I was putting my home studio together. I researched um, mic pre's a lot. I just didn't know anything about them, and I was trying to get a feel of what would be good for me. And I realized that my um, most of my experiences in the studio, in great studios in New York City, the boards were Neves.
Yeah.
So I thought, screw it, let me just stick with what I know. I mean, they were a hefty investment, a great investment, and that now they're worth a lot more than what I paid for them. But what I wanted to be able to do was be able to record, obviously, electric guitar, but like also acoustic guitar, get a stereo acoustic guitar track that I really felt was, something at least approaching the quality of what I had been able to do in a studio.
Hmm.
So I bought a couple of Sheps microphones, and a couple of ribbon microphones. I've never been able to get like a U47 or 67, but I feel like I can get a stereo recording of an acoustic guitar that sounds really nice.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, and when you let's say you set up the Sheps, you go through the Neves, and then into your Apollo.
Mhm.
Um, is there a uh, is there a way in the Apollo to bypass the pre's that are in
Yeah,
there?
yeah. You just set the Apollo, I think, to line, and it
Oh,
bypasses pre.
oh, okay.
As
Yeah,
far as I know,
that
maybe all
makes
the years
sense.
I've been doing it wrong. I mean, I've had all kinds of, well, not all kinds of, I've had 3 or 4 different interfaces since 2000, which is when I think I got an M box. Remember those?
I I do.
Yeah. And then
Yeah.
I had a Digi 002, which was not very good. And then a Digi 002 that had been modded by a company called Black Lion
Hmm.
that does great modifications. And then when that uh, burned out, I bought this, and I've always just made that determination wherever you have to choose it, in the interface, to have, I guess it's line, so that then it just sees you know it doesn't do anything to the sound.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense.
Part of my challenge with this thing is I like to use. I have a couple of outboard effects processors, believe it or not, in the days of plugins. I always love the sounds of lexicon reverbs.
Yeah.
So I got a PCM 90 some time ago, and I also have an original Eventide H910 harmonizer, the thing that's like from the mid 70s, which is a pitch shift and
Yeah.
digital delay, which just is like the most bizarre and unpredictable, fantastic effect.
Hmm.
Very finicky, the thing will break in a second. Anyway, the reason I mention that is that in order to use them as hardware inserts in a Pro Tools session, you just have to have ins and outs on your interface that will allow you to create an aux track where the audio is being sent through your external hardware, effects processor, whatever it is. Could be mic pre's, could be a guitar pedal, and then comes back in. There's a strange thing with, I don't know if it's all of the UAD things, but there's after much research, I discovered that it's a really boring topic. You can't just put things in the same in and out. You have to offset them because of a strange configuration that the monitor outputs use the first two outputs of the whole interface. And when you do ins and outs, you have to like go in one and out three or something like that in order for them to register. That's an incredibly boring topic, but one that I finally figured out, and that allows me to use these effects processors that I really love. And also any guitar effect, because at the recommendation of one of the guys at Bunker Studio, John, I got this reamp box, because if you try to plug a guitar pedal into an interface as an insert, there's not really enough gain. So I got this thing that Radial makes, and I'm not endorsing them, but this is a fantastic tool. It basically ups the level of in and out, input and output gain, and allows you to run anything in Pro Tools through any external effects processor or effects pedal.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I can't tout the wonders of this very simple thing enough. I mean, I have all these fantastic floor pedals that I've collected over the years, new and vintage. And it allows you to, you could take like a Phase 90 and put the drum set through it, So that's a really cool thing.
That's like the yellow, it's kind of a yellow colored box. I'm picturing the Radial reamp, or
Orange, actually.
it's orange. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you've got your drum tracks in Pro Tools and you want to run it through your Phase 90. I know the Phase 90 is orange.
Of course you do.
And so since we're there, just break it down. So you've got your drum tracks, you've got your Phase 90. How do you make it all happen?
So the Radial reamp box, you have to send an output into this is just the reamp box before you plug any effects into it. You have to send its output to the input, the appropriate input on your interface, and the appropriate output on your interface to the input of the Radial, right? So in a perfect world, that would be in and out one. Not the case on the UAD, unfortunately, but
right.
On a board, let's say.
Right.
So now that reamp box is just in it will show up on whatever, in Pro Tools, or if you're working with in Logic, it now has the potential to be seen as an IO, insert. And then from the Radial, you would there's two sets of sends and returns. So on the Radial, you would take the send into the input of your Phase 90, and the output that would normally go to the amp to the return on the Radial. So now the thing is ready to go. And you have to then, in Pro Tools, which is what I work with, you would create an auxiliary input where you might put, a plug-in if you don't want to put it directly on a track. And you find there's as opposed to selecting a plug-in that you would put as the insert on that auxiliary input track, I don't know why I'm making this. I see it on that part of the screen because I've done it so many times. If it goes in and out on 1 and 2 or whatever that would be, you select that insert on your aux track so that it's sending and receiving in the same input and output that it's plugged into on your interface. So
Okay.
well, the radial is not a stereo thing, so it would be in 4, out 4. So you would go insert 4, where you would normally put a plug in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd have to do the thing that you do with a auxiliary input, that a bus input. So I put
Right.
bus 4. And then if the drum track is on something, I create a bus on the drum track, and then send that bus to the aux input. And that's, your phase shifter would come up much in the way that a plug-in comes up.
Right.
And it's fantastic. I mean, I did this thinking this will never work. Um, so, and it's like the whole drum track, it's like, it's going through the phase 90. It's fantastic. I actually did all of this because I bought a tube Echoplex from the 60s a few months ago. I've always wanted one. I love the sound of them. And I tried to plug it into the interface, and there's so little gain in that application that you'd have to turn the send up so loud, and it would sort of distort. And then I was doing a session at Bunker, and John, who was engineering, said, "Oh man, he had an Echoplex." And I said, "How do you use it as a plug-in?" He said, "You got to get this radial thing." So I did that, and it's fantastic. Like, I plugged the Echoplex in. I have an old Fender standalone reverb tank.
Yeah.
Send that thing in, you put the drums through the spring reverb. It's just fantastic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Huh.
Different effects, they don't always sound they don't interact with the sound in this exact same way that they do if you plug your guitar into it and then send it to an amp. Some of them will do sort of funny things, but it's sort of all desirable as far as I'm concerned. Like,
right.
The reverb, you send a snare drum into the spring reverb and it kind of goes, in some strange way. And it's so.
Oh man, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah, I can't recommend that box or something like it highly enough. It's really useful. And you can also use it to reamp things. You can use it to send and return an amp. If you have, like, let's say, I used to do this, I did this a lot on a record that I made when I had still was working with the Digi 002, take a direct bass sound and reamp it, and then send that signal back into Pro Tools. That's very useful.
So you've got a bass track that you recorded direct into Pro Tools, and then you use the radial box to send it out from your Pro Tools rig into a physical amp.
Exactly.
And then you mic the amp.
Right. So at home also, this is a sort of another topic, but I have because I like to use the natural power tube overdrive of amplifiers, I have an enclosed speaker cabinet with a Royer ribbon on it, because a lot of times I have an old Marshall that I like to crank, so it muffles the sound enough, or that it's doable in the apartment. So for bass tracks, it's one of the first vintage amps I bought. I have a black panel Bassman. So any direct bass track that you put into that thing, it immediately sounds like a tube, an old tube bass amp.
Oh, wow.
You can just record that. I don't, most of the time people I work with record with amplifiers. And the reason I discovered this, or not discovered it, people have been doing it for years, but I have this band called Dice with Nate Smith and Fima Efron. And I had asked, I can't remember what it was. We were doing this tune that was sort of like a metal tune. And Fima was recording through an old SVT, like a big Ampeg thing. But the tune, I think I was playing a Les Paul through my Marshall on 10,
Hmm.
which basically just obliterated everything. Not that we were in the same room,
Right.
but I was trying to use the tube amp, the SVT that FEMA was playing with, but it just, with my sound, everything just got kind of just a big, low mid mess. So I found that FEMA's direct sound fit into the mix better. And then when I really got into the details, I was like, it fits in the mix better, but it sounds like a direct bass sound
Hmm.
in the midst of this kind of, Les Paul through a Marshall sound.
Right.
So I took his direct sound and put it through my Bassman, and it was like a revelation. Man, this, kept the clarity of the direct sound, but just added that kind of warmth that you would get from a tube amp.
Wow. Okay. Uh, I'm sold. I'm gonna get one of
And
those
this is a great,
boxes.
I mean, it's probably about $250, but man, I'm telling you,
Yeah.
it is fantastic.